Hello and welcome, I'm Kira Scribner, and I'm going to talk about the most underrated books ever, which is children's and middle grade books. I love reading books aimed toward young readers, and they get fully neglected here, and I will admit that I sometimes neglect them more than I wish I could. So this list will include some picture books, some middle grade books, some more chaptery books, as well as some nonfiction and classics. It's gonna be a fun ride. We're gonna start right off the bat with one of my favorite reading experiences of this year, and that had to be Little Women. And this is adapted. This is a children's book, and it has beautiful illustrations, as you can tell. Last year in 2022 I went to Stratford, which is the local theater near me, and there was one for children's that adapted this, and I bought this at the gift store, so that was really fun. And I just had a wonderful experience because I as a person read it, but I also read it so many times because I read it with my nephew, and it is wonderful to see like little boys reading books and being so excited that are aimed toward feminine readers. And that was really lovely. And then I also read it with my pastor's kids. They have 3 kids over the age of 1, so the 1-year-old wasn't that interested. But the other 3, I just read it like probably like 6 times because they kept on being like, I want to read it again. And it was just really delightful. And then we talked about dresses and all of the beautiful things, and it was just a really lovely experience of being able to like tell kids the stories that are beautiful and like why we continue to tell these stories. Another book that I really enjoyed was Frizzy, and this was a graphic novel and it is aimed toward a middle-aged audience. It is by Claribel A. Ortega, and it looks at Black women and their hair and the ways in which people have perpetuated the way that hair should be. And it's really powerful and really hard at the same time because I think that she's age 12 and her mother brings her to the salon every week to like straighten her hair, and she finds it really painful, and she keeps on trying to figure out ways that she can naturally have her hair. But it's really talking about the ways in which Black hair has been politicized and considered only beautiful when it looks like white hair, and it's just like a really beautiful and lovely conversation about this. In connection with this, I think another beautiful book is Inheritance by Elizabeth Acevedo. This is a lawn poem that came out in 2022, and it is also about Black hair, and she released it like when her daughter was born, and I think that's just really lovely. I love that natural hair is being able to be like represented and like passed on as something that like is a beautiful legacy. I feel like especially Frizzy does a really good job of looking at how the mother has her own trauma around the ways in which she was bullied because of her hair. So the way that she's so harsh to her daughter perpetuates some of the own hurt that she hasn't like fully unwrapped and figured out, and so she's not listening to her daughter because she's like thinking she's protecting her. And I think that that is a really beautiful book. Another book that I really loved is Light Princess. This is a classic fairy tale by George MacDonald. I always thought it was about like the light princess as in like brightness, but it's the light princess and it is in she has no gravity, and it's very similar to Sleeping Beauty. She's cursed as a little girl, and because her aunt is not invited to her christening, and because of this she curses her to never have any gravity, which also means emotional gravity as well. I really loved the way George MacDonald writes and the humor and the joys of his narration. It's very personal and very funny and satirical, but it also has a lot of conversations about the ways in which emotions are needed and like grief is needed. It really touches on the idea that like humor and lightness and joy has no value without also sorrow. And I think that's really powerful. It is a book that includes some really terrible representations of Asian people in several paragraphs as people appearing as wise men and being laughed at in not complimentary ways at all. So I will give that warning if you go into this book that there's conversations be happening, especially with children, about the ways that we have this. I want to begin all of these by saying one of my favorites, but obviously that's what this list is about. But this book like brought me so much joy, and it was called The Little Books of Little Brontës, and I loved it so much. This is a picture book by Sarah O'Leary, who is a Canadian author, and she's talking about these little books. So if you know some Bronte lore, you know that they have these like Tales of Angria and stuff like that, in which they made these fantasy worlds and these stories, and all of them wrote them on these little books because they didn't have a lot of money and they didn't have paper to spare, so you can like barely read them, and we have them today and we can read them, and some of them have been publicized and stuff. But it's this beautiful book about like friendship and togetherness. This childhood wonder and creativity would lead to these people to be novelists, and she also has like a write-up in the back about their stories. I think it was just like a lovely book to highlight creativity and joy and like the ways that family and hardship come together, and I just really liked it as a book. My next slot is just going to be for all of my Dr. Seuss that I read this year. And I've not read a lot of Dr. Seuss in the past, but I had some fun. It started with the fact that I was nannying for the summer and into the fall, and I was nannying a 1.5-year-old who loved the foot book more than everything. And that was just like really delightful. I did read it probably like 65 to 200 times, but it was really wonderful. And then I also read the Lorax because it is one of my friends Hannah's like favorite book, and she read it to me, and it was just like really special to have someone like read, you know, this book for you and like tell how much it meant for throughout her childhood and all of those things. So that was really beautiful, and it has like this theme around like, you know, we have to care and like anti-capitalistic and like pro-environment. And it was just like a really powerful story about how like we can't always choose to have money as the focus. We have to choose community and people and sustainability, and I think it was just really lovely. And then I was having a hard November and I picked up How the Grinch Stole Christmas, and it was beautiful. I know the story obviously, but I'd never read the book, and he does such beautiful poetry and like the way that he writes stories. And at the end where he talks about how his heart is not too tight now, that he can like enjoy because his heart has like expanded. It brought emotions, okay? It really did. Another book that blew me out of the water was Starfish. This is by Lisa Phipps, and it's so good. It's a middle grade book that looks a lot at fatphobia. It is a hard book to read because the verbal abuse that she gets from her mother especially is horrendous. We have a girl who's plus sized and living her life as an adolescent, and her friend is moving away. So she's like, now I'm going to be alone, and she befriends this other girl, and she loves to swim. And it's really about like finding people who are willing to accept you who you are. And like there's also the story of like her friend Catalina is Mexican and part of her family is undocumented, so we have a conversation about racism as well as like fat phobia and like abuse in families and the way those conversations happen. And it is like horrendous. Like the amount of abuse that her mother especially has is like very heavy, but I think that it's so powerful, and these conversations happen over and over and over again. And I think that sometimes we go, no mother would do that, and it's like no, mothers do that. And it was a book that was really powerful for me to read as an adult, as someone who has struggled with an eating disorder for 15 years now, and who was denied treatment for my anorexia as a teenager because I wasn't light enough. As I've gotten older and recovered from a physical sense, even though I really struggle with the mental part of it now, I've learned coping mechanisms in order to not starve myself. I've received terrible comments as well as doctors trying to put me on weight loss pills, and I'm like, no, I came in here and I told you that I gained weight as a positive sense because I dealt with anorexia for over 10 years. And they're like, yeah, so now you're gonna have to lose weight. It's all of those things that it's so ingrained into culture, and we perpetuate it onto children, especially girls. And this book really looks at it in a way that I wish I had seen as a child myself. And I think this is a really powerful book for children to read and to have conversations and to really learn that your weight does not dictate your value, and it does not dictate what you can do. Because like a big part of it is also her going to therapy and looking at that, and that is, I really love positive representation of therapy. And she has like her fat girl rules and like learning how she can tell herself that those aren't things that bind her, and having conversation about like no, like you say that you love me, but the way that you speak to me is not okay. And I really appreciate this book, and I cannot wait for what Lisa Phipps writes next, because I think that she knocked it out of the park with her debut. Another book that gave me hope and beauty was Something Someday by Amanda Gorman. And she is a well-known author and poet now. But this is a children's book that looks at how, you know, everyone kind of says that it's not getting better and all of these things. And it's really about letting children see hope and see beauty in reality. And kind of how, as older people, we can be cynical and we can kind of try to dash children's dreams. And that we shouldn't just look for beauty in fiction, in like fantasy, but also see the beauty of the world around us. And I really love redemptive hope, and I think that the picture book is just full of that redemptive hope, and it made me really happy to read it and just be like, yes, these are the kind of books that it have hard conversations about the things happening in the world, but we also don't want to imagine that cynicism is the only correct approach to that. Another book that I absolutely loved was Harbour Me by Jacqueline Woodson. And Jacqueline Woodson has been one of my favorite authors for a while now, and she is a very prolific writer of both children's and middle grades and adult books. And I think that this book really captures so many conversations. It is set in Brooklyn, and it is, I think, 6 middle grade students, and they are in a special education class, and the teacher decides that for the last period every single day she's going to leave them and to have conversations. So they have conversations and each of them tell their stories, and it is so powerful because it's really talking about the ways that we harbor one another. So the quote is from A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, which is up there, and it's one of my favorite books. I read it a few years ago and was just like, wow, this book is my book, you know? And this is talking about the idea of like harboring is like we can choose to like allow people's pain and experiences and heart to like be in us. And part of it is that this is a time capsule so that years later that they kind of can know what they're experiencing. And I think that we don't often allow children to like have hard conversations alone, if that makes sense. Like, you know, again, we often trivialize kids or we don't give them space to have conversations. And I think having conversations with adults is really important, but having space to have those conversations with each other. Jacqueline Woodson is also really incredible at writing really short books. Like this is a petite book, but it like packs a punch in a really powerful way. I read the audiobook and her 10-year-old son is also one of the narrators, and there's an interview at the end of it with her son about his experiences and like how, you know, the ways in which his life intersects with this book. And I just thought it was like really powerful and wonderful. And yeah, Jacqueline Woodson is just amazing. The next book I'm going to talk about is Yes We Can, which is a collection of like vignettes and short biographies of Asian Americans in the United States. And so I learned a lot, whether it was from Mamie Tape, who was one of the girls who was a little child who was fighting against the ways that schools were segregated and fighting for that. I learned about Jeremy Lin, who was the first Asian American in the NBA, that's correct, the national basketball thing. And I also learned a lot about the massacres of Chinese miners during the time of the 1880s. And it was a really powerful book. I would have loved for some sections to be a little more bulkier. I'm in love with Vashti Harrison, who does a similar thing where she will write small biographies about people in Black history or in women's history, and it is like so wonderful and beautiful. And hers are a little bit longer on the biography, and I would have loved that. But I definitely thought that this was like a wonderful jumping off point. And I also would have preferred it to be a little bit more diverse. It was very East Asian focused, and we had a few Indian Americans as well. There was a lot of Asian experience that was not represented on the page as well. And yeah, I would have loved it to be a little bit more wider in scope. But Kelly Yang is an author that I've been meaning to read for so many years. Like, I feel like when we talk about mashed potato, like authors that like you are convinced you're gonna like, so you overhype it in your mind and then you struggle. I have had about 4 of Kelly Yang's books out of the library, probably at least 4 or 5 times each. And I'm always like, yes, I shall do this. And then I never do. So hopefully 2024 is the year in which I read more Kelly Yang. But this was like a great book. And I think that it's a really cool jumping off spot for more conversations about Asian Americans. And then I wanted to finish this with a conversation of one more book. This is Velveteen Rabbit, and this is a reread. I read it as a child. It was my favorite book, which I think explains a lot about who I am as a person. It is a story about a toy rabbit, and he is not the newest, he's not the most fashionable. It's about how toys become real when they are loved and when they are bruised and like beaten around by being in children's lives, and they don't have to be pristine. I also love a good story that's set in the early 1900s and has to do with illness and near death and all of the sadness, you know. That's who I am. I hope that you enjoyed my conversation about my favorite middle grade books of 2023. Tell me, do you read children's books? Because if you don't, you should. And I would love to know some of your favorites and yeah, recommendations for 2024, because I definitely go through periods where I'll read like 10 of them and then I won't read them for a few months. And I don't want that to be the thing. I want to love and celebrate middle grades and children's books across the year in 2024. So I'll see you next time. Bye.